Grandma, don't drink that. Those 4 words stopped my hand in midair. The glass of wine was already halfway to my lips. The room had been warm a second earlier, full of laughter, clinking plates, and that comfortable noise families make when everyone believes they're exactly where they belong. But the moment my grandson Ethan whispered those words, everything changed. I froze. The glass hovered inches from my mouth. And suddenly I could feel it. Every pair of eyes at the table was on me. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where something shifts in the air, but no one says it out loud? Where you feel like the entire room is waiting for something, but you don't know what? That's exactly how it felt. Let me take you back to the beginning of that night. It was my 67th birthday. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extravagant. Just a family dinner, or at least that's what I thought it would be. My son Daniel had insisted on organizing everything. "Mom, you've done enough birthdays for everyone else," he told me on the phone earlier that week. "This time you just show up and relax." Daniel is 42. Successful. Confident. The kind of man who walks into a room and instantly takes charge of it. He works in real estate development now. Tall, charming, persuasive. People trust him easily. Sometimes too easily. But that night, none of those thoughts were in my mind. All I knew was that my family had gathered to celebrate me. The restaurant Daniel chose was one of those places that tries very hard to feel intimate. Soft amber lighting. Dark wooden walls. White tablecloths so crisp they almost looked ironed onto the table. We had a private room in the back. Just family. Daniel sat across from me. His wife Claire sat beside him, elegant as always, her hair perfectly styled, her posture straight like she was posing for a photograph. Claire is 39 and has a talent for making every gathering look like it belongs in a lifestyle magazine. My grandson Ethan sat next to her. 6 years old. Quiet. Observant. The kind of child who watches more than he talks. That night he had been drawing pictures on the paper menu with a crayon the waiter gave him. And honestly, everything about the evening seemed normal. Maybe even a little too normal. Dinner had barely started when Daniel reached for the wine bottle. "I brought something special tonight," he said, holding it up like a prize. It was a deep red bottle with a gold label. Expensive. At least it looked expensive. He stood up and began pouring glasses. First Claire's. Then his own. Then mine. But something about the way he did it caught my attention. He poured my glass last. Slowly. Very carefully. Almost like he was measuring something. At the time I didn't question it. Why would I? He slid the glass across the table toward me with a smile. "To Mom," he said. Claire lifted her glass. Ethan looked up from his drawing. The waiter had just placed my birthday dessert menu in front of me. Everyone was watching. "Make a wish," Claire said. I laughed. "Do I get to wish before the cake even arrives?" "Tonight you get to do whatever you want," Daniel said. So I reached for the glass. My fingers wrapped around the stem. The wine caught the warm light from the ceiling. Deep red. Smooth. Perfectly normal. At least it looked normal. I lifted it toward my mouth. And that's when Ethan's hand grabbed my wrist. Not hard. But firm enough to stop me. "Grandma." His voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Don't drink that." I blinked. "What?" He leaned closer. Close enough that I could feel his breath against my arm. And then he whispered again. "Don't drink that." For a moment I honestly thought he was joking. Kids say strange things all the time. But when I looked at his face, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. He wasn't joking. He looked serious. The kind of serious you don't expect from a 6-year-old. My hand slowly lowered the glass. The room had gone quiet. Too quiet. Daniel leaned forward quickly. Mom, what's wrong? I glanced at him. And that's when I noticed it. His eyes weren't on me. They were on the glass. Nothing, I said slowly. Ethan's small hand was still gripping my wrist. I turned slightly toward him. Why shouldn't I drink it? He hesitated. Then he looked across the table. Straight at his father. And suddenly Daniel reached for the glass. Too fast. Hey, buddy, Daniel said quickly. Grandma's fine. Let go of her hand. But Ethan didn't move. Instead he whispered something that made my heart skip. I saw Daddy put something in it. The words hung in the air. And in that exact moment, I realized something terrifying. No one at that table looked surprised. And my son was still reaching for the glass. But what happened next would turn a simple birthday dinner into the most shocking night of my life. What would you do if a 6-year-old accused his own father of poisoning someone? Would you laugh it off? Would you assume the child misunderstood something? Or would you suddenly realize that the room you're sitting in isn't safe anymore? Because that's exactly where I found myself. My son Daniel's hand was still reaching for the glass. Slowly. Carefully. Too carefully. The moment Ethan whispered, I saw Daddy put something in it, the entire table went silent. Not the comfortable silence families share. This was the kind of silence that feels heavy. Like everyone is holding their breath. Daniel forced a smile. Buddy, he said, chuckling lightly, what are you talking about? But his hand didn't stop moving toward the wine glass. And that's when I did something instinctive. I slid the glass away from him. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough that his fingers stopped inches short of touching it. Daniel's smile tightened. Mom, he said, still trying to sound casual, Ethan probably saw me opening the bottle earlier. I looked at Ethan. Sweetheart, I said gently, what did you see? He swallowed. His small fingers still wrapped around my wrist. And then he said something that made Daniel's chair scrape loudly against the floor. I saw Daddy put drops in the wine. Drops. Not powder. Not something falling in by accident. Drops. The word echoed in my mind like a warning bell. Daniel leaned forward immediately. Okay, that's enough, he said quickly. His voice was sharper now. Claire placed her hand lightly on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan, honey, she said softly, sometimes grown-up things look confusing. But Ethan didn't look confused. He looked certain. And that's when I noticed something else. Daniel wasn't looking at Ethan. He was looking at me. Specifically. He was looking at the wine glass. Have you ever noticed how someone's eyes can give away everything they're trying to hide? That's what I saw in that moment. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Something worse. Panic. I slowly lifted the glass again. But this time I didn't bring it toward my mouth. I held it up in the light. The wine looked normal. Deep red. Smooth. No bubbles. No strange smell. Nothing floating inside. But suddenly it didn't feel normal. The room felt colder. Daniel, I said calmly, did you put something in this? Claire laughed quickly. Too quickly. Maggie, of course he didn't, she said. It's just wine. But Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair. Crossed his arms. And said something that immediately raised every alarm bell in my mind. Mom, Ethan's 6 years old. That was it. No denial. No explanation. Just a reminder of the child's age. Now let me tell you something about myself. Before I retired, I spent 32 years as a high school principal. 32 years of watching teenagers try to lie their way out of trouble. You learn something after 3 decades of that. When someone is falsely accused, they defend themselves immediately. When someone is guilty, they redirect. And Daniel was redirecting. I gently pulled my wrist free from Ethan's grip. Then I placed the wine glass back on the table. Right in the center. Between us. Okay, I said. My voice was calm. Too calm. If there's nothing in it, then we shouldn't have a problem. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Problem with what? With someone else drinking it. For a second, no one moved. Claire blinked. Daniel stared at me. Ethan looked up at both of us, wide-eyed. And then Daniel laughed. But it wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind people use when they feel cornered. Mom, come on, he said. Don't make this weird. Weird. That word hung in the air like a bad joke. Weird? I repeated. You think it's weird that a child says he saw something put in my drink, and I want to make sure it's safe? Claire leaned forward. Maggie, she said carefully, this is your birthday dinner. Let's not ruin it with misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. Interesting choice of word. But there was something else happening now. Something subtle. Daniel wasn't looking at the glass anymore. He was looking at me. Studying me. Like he was calculating something. And suddenly I realized something that made my stomach drop. He wasn't worried about Ethan's accusation. He was worried about whether I believed it. I leaned back in my chair slowly. Then I pushed the glass a few inches toward him. Daniel, I said. If there's nothing in the wine, drink it. The silence that followed was so thick it almost felt physical. Claire's fingers tightened on Ethan's shoulder. Daniel stared at the glass. Just stared. 1 second passed. Then 2. Then 3. And that's when I knew. Because if the wine had truly been normal, he would have picked up the glass immediately. Instead, my son did something I never expected. He didn't touch the glass. He looked at Claire. And Claire looked back at him. Just a quick glance. But it said everything. And suddenly a terrifying thought entered my mind. What if Daniel wasn't the only one who knew what was in that glass? But the next thing Ethan said would make the entire situation even worse. Why would a 6-year-old risk getting his own father in trouble? That was the question running through my mind as the silence at the table stretched longer and longer. Children protect their parents. Even when those parents are wrong. Even when they're scared. So for Ethan to say what he said, to sit there so firmly, gripping my wrist, refusing to let go. Something about that didn't add up. And just as that thought crossed my mind, Ethan spoke again. I saw the bottle. His voice was small, but steady. Daniel immediately straightened. Ethan, he said sharply, that's enough. But Ethan shook his head. No, he said quietly. And then he looked directly at me. Grandma, Daddy had a little bottle. The words made Claire inhale sharply. Just a quick breath. But I heard it. I turned slowly toward her. Her smile had disappeared. Ethan, she said gently, forcing warmth back into her voice, sweetheart, sometimes grown-ups have medicine. Medicine. Interesting word. Daniel seized the opportunity immediately. Exactly, he said quickly. I had vitamins in the kitchen earlier. Ethan probably saw that. Vitamins. Drops. Medicine. The explanations were starting to pile up. But none of them actually explained the one thing that mattered. Why he wouldn't drink the wine. I tapped the stem of the glass lightly with my finger. The faint sound of crystal against wood echoed in the quiet room. Then drink it, I repeated. Daniel exhaled through his nose. The kind of exhale someone makes when they're trying to stay calm. Mom, he said, lowering his voice, you're making a scene. A scene? I asked. You're accusing your own son of something ridiculous. Ridiculous. That word landed hard. Because a moment ago it had been Ethan imagining things. Now it was me making accusations. The story was shifting. I glanced at Ethan again. He was staring at the glass. Not at his father. Not at Claire. Just the glass. Ethan, I said softly, what did the bottle look like? Daniel's chair scraped against the floor again. Mom, stop interrogating him. But Ethan answered anyway. It was little, he said. He held up his fingers, about 2 inches apart. Like this. Then he added something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It had a dropper. A dropper. Not a vitamin bottle. Not a medicine cap. A dropper. Daniel stood up. The movement was sudden enough that Ethan flinched. Okay, Daniel said, running a hand through his hair, this is getting ridiculous. He turned toward the door of the private dining room. I'm getting the waiter. We're ordering dinner. But I noticed something very strange. He still hadn't touched the wine. Not his glass. Not mine. None of them. Almost like he didn't want anyone drinking it. And suddenly another question formed in my mind. A question that made the situation even darker. If there was something in the bottle, how many glasses had it gone into? I looked around the table. Claire's wine sat untouched. Daniel's glass was full. And mine? Mine was the only one that had been placed directly in front of me. The only one Daniel had poured last. Slowly. Carefully. Almost like he was measuring. Daniel, I said. He stopped halfway to the door. What? I slid the glass another inch toward him. Sit down. He hesitated. Just for a second. Then he turned back toward the table. Mom. Sit. There was something about the tone of my voice that made him stop arguing. Maybe it was habit. Old habits die hard. For years, when he was younger, that voice meant the conversation was over. And apparently some part of him still remembered that. Daniel slowly sat back down. Claire looked between us nervously. Maggie, she said carefully, this is blowing out of proportion. Is it? I leaned forward slightly. Then I said something that made Daniel's face go pale. Let's call Dr. Green. That got his attention. Dr. Harold Green had been our family doctor for almost 30 years. He delivered Laura. He treated Daniel's broken arm when he was 9. And most importantly, he knew every medication I took. Why would you call him? Daniel asked quickly. Because if Ethan saw drops going into the wine. I picked up my phone. I'd like to know what kind of drops might make someone pass out. The word pass out seemed to hit Daniel like a physical blow. Mom, that's insane. But I was already dialing. Dr. Green answered on the 3rd ring. Maggie, he said. Everything okay? I glanced at the glass again. The deep red liquid looked calm. Harmless. But suddenly it felt like the most dangerous thing in the room. Harold, I said quietly, can I ask you something strange? Of course. If someone mixed certain medications with alcohol. I paused. What could happen? Dr. Green didn't answer immediately. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. Well, Maggie, depending on the medication, it could make someone lose consciousness very quickly. I slowly looked up. Daniel was staring at me. Not angry. Not defensive. Terrified. And in that exact moment, I realized something even worse. Because if Daniel expected me to lose consciousness tonight, then someone had planned what would happen after. Why would someone need you to lose consciousness? That question kept echoing in my mind after Dr. Green said those words. Lose consciousness. Not feel dizzy. Not feel sleepy. Unconscious. The kind of word doctors use when something serious is involved. And the moment that word left his mouth, I saw Daniel's expression change. Just for a split second. But it was enough. Because I had known my son for 42 years. And I had never seen that look on his face before. Fear. Real fear. Not the kind someone shows when they're embarrassed or caught in a misunderstanding. This was the kind of fear someone shows when a plan starts falling apart. "Harold," I said into the phone, "how fast could that happen?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well," he said carefully, "depending on the medication and the dosage, it could happen within minutes." Minutes. The word settled into the room like smoke. I thanked him quickly and ended the call. No one spoke. Daniel's eyes were still locked on me. Claire looked like she had stopped breathing entirely. And Ethan? Ethan was still staring at the glass. 6 years old. And somehow the only person in that room who had tried to stop what might have happened. I placed my phone down slowly. "Daniel," I said. "Yes?" His voice sounded strained now. Tight. Controlled. I slid the wine glass toward him again. This time stopping it directly in front of his plate. "If there's nothing in it." I let the sentence hang there. "You drink it." Claire immediately leaned forward. "Maggie, this is absurd." "Is it? You're accusing Daniel of drugging you." "No," I said calmly. "I'm asking him to prove he didn't." Daniel stared at the glass again. Still unmoving. Seconds passed. Long ones. Then finally he spoke. "I'm not drinking it." The words landed heavily. There it was. Not a denial. Not a defense. Just refusal. "Why not?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair. Crossed his arms. "You're being dramatic, Mom." "Then prove it." "I don't have to prove anything." "Interesting." I tapped the table gently. "You poured it." "So?" "You insist there's nothing in it." "There isn't." "Then drink it." Daniel's jaw tightened. And suddenly Claire spoke again. This time faster. More nervous. "Maybe the wine just went bad," she said quickly. "Went bad?" That made me blink. Wine doesn't go bad in the 5 minutes it takes to pour it. And she knew that. Everyone at the table knew that. Even Ethan looked confused by that explanation. I leaned back slowly. Then I said something that made the entire conversation shift. "Daniel. Do you remember the lake house?" His eyes flickered. Just for a moment. "Yes." "Do you remember the last time we argued about it?" Claire sat very still now. Daniel said nothing. So I continued. "You wanted me to sell it." "That's not what this is about." "No?" "That property is worth millions now," he said sharply. "There it is." Claire closed her eyes briefly. Like she knew exactly where this conversation was going. But I kept talking. "You've been pushing me for months." "That's because it's a smart decision. For you. For the family." "The family." That word again. I studied him carefully. "You already had a developer interested, didn't you?" Daniel's silence answered the question. "You were waiting for my signature." "You're twisting this." "And when I refused?" Daniel leaned forward suddenly. His patience was gone now. "You're 70 years old, Mom." The words came out before he could stop them. The moment they landed in the air, even he seemed to realize how bad they sounded. Claire's eyes widened. Ethan looked up at him. I tilted my head slightly. 67, I corrected calmly. But the damage was done. Daniel rubbed his temples. "You're not thinking about the future." "My future?" "Our future." There it was again. Future. Money. Property. Pressure. And suddenly a very clear picture began forming in my mind. I looked down at the wine glass again. Deep red. Untouched. Then I looked back at my son. Daniel, I said quietly. Were you planning to drive me home tonight? He froze. The question clearly caught him off guard. What? After dinner. He blinked. Yes, obviously. You insisted on it. I was being polite. Were you? The room was silent again. And then I asked the question that made Claire's hand grip the edge of the table. If I had passed out tonight. I paused. Who would have been there to explain it? Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the more he spoke, the more the pieces were falling into place. Ethan's warning. The drops. The untouched wine. The sudden urgency. And the lake house. But what Daniel said next finally cracked the entire story open. Because my son looked at me, exhaled slowly, and said something that changed everything. You wouldn't have been hurt. If someone tells you, you wouldn't have been hurt, what does that really mean? Think about that for a second. Because people only say that when they already know something bad was about to happen. The moment Daniel said those words, the entire room seemed to tilt. You wouldn't have been hurt. Not nothing was in the wine. Not this is ridiculous. Not Ethan misunderstood. Just that. Claire's head snapped toward him immediately. Daniel, she whispered. But it was too late. Once a sentence like that escapes, you can't pull it back. I leaned forward slowly. Daniel, I said, keeping my voice steady, why would I need to be reassured that I wouldn't be hurt? He ran a hand down his face. The confident developer. The charming negotiator. The man who could talk investors into million-dollar deals. Suddenly he looked like a teenager who'd just been caught doing something stupid. You're twisting my words, he muttered. Am I? The wine glass sat between us like evidence in a courtroom. Untouched. Heavy with implication. I pushed it another inch toward him. Drink it. His eyes flicked to the glass. Then back to me. No. And there it was. No hesitation this time. No pretending. Just refusal. Claire sat up straighter. Maggie, please, she said quickly. This dinner is getting out of control. Out of control. I almost laughed. My grandson had just warned me not to drink something. My son refused to touch it himself. And somehow I was the one making things out of control. Interesting logic. I turned toward Ethan again. He was sitting very still now. Watching the adults like a small referee in a very strange game. Ethan, I said gently, do you remember where Daddy was when you saw the bottle? Daniel groaned. Mom, stop. But Ethan answered anyway. In the kitchen, he said. At home? He nodded. Before we left. Claire's fingers tightened on the tablecloth. I noticed that. Small details matter. Especially when people are nervous. And the bottle? I asked. What color was it? Ethan frowned slightly, thinking. Brown, he said. Like medicine. Daniel stood up suddenly. Okay. That's enough. His chair scraped loudly across the floor. A couple of diners outside the private room glanced through the doorway. The atmosphere inside the room had shifted completely now. The birthday dinner was gone. This was something else. Mom, Daniel said firmly, you're embarrassing everyone. Am I? Yes. Then answer a simple question. He crossed his arms. What? What was in the dropper bottle? Daniel stared at me. The silence stretched again. Then he said something that almost sounded like a confession. It wasn't poison. Claire closed her eyes. I didn't move. Not an inch. Because the words he just used told me everything. Not poison. Which meant something was in the wine. You're right, I said quietly. Maybe it wasn't poison. Daniel shifted his weight. Relief flickered across his face for half a second. Like he thought the conversation might finally be calming down. Then I said the next sentence. But that doesn't mean it was harmless. The relief vanished. Claire spoke again quickly. It was just something to help you relax. I turned to her slowly. Relax? You've been stressed lately. Stressed. Interesting. And wine wasn't enough? Claire hesitated. Daniel stepped in. It was just a sedative. There it was. Finally. The truth cracked through the surface. Ethan's eyes widened. Claire looked like she wished the floor would swallow her whole. And I sat there quietly, letting the words settle in. A sedative, I repeated. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. It was mild. Mild enough to knock me unconscious? No. How mild? He didn't answer. Because the truth was obvious now. They hadn't expected questions. They hadn't expected resistance. And they definitely hadn't expected a 6-year-old to ruin the entire plan. I folded my hands calmly on the table. Daniel, I said. What? Why? He laughed once. A bitter sound. You wouldn't understand. Try me. He looked at Claire again. The same glance they had shared earlier. A silent conversation. Then he said something that made my heart sink. You weren't going to sign the lake house. Of course. You wanted control of the property. I wanted what was best for the family. The family, I repeated. Yes. So your solution? I gestured toward the wine glass. Was to drug your mother? His face hardened. You make it sound worse than it is. Do I? You would have just fallen asleep. And then what? Daniel hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Because whatever came next. He hadn't planned on saying it out loud. But eventually, he did. We needed you to sign a document. Claire covered her mouth. The room went completely still. Even Ethan stopped fidgeting. My voice dropped almost to a whisper. What document? Daniel swallowed. And then he said the one thing I never thought I'd hear from my own son. A power of attorney.